Shirley Temple signed her first contract with 20th Century Fox in 1933. She was 3 years old. Her mother signed it for her. That was legal. That was standard. That was Hollywood. By the time Shirley Temple was 6, she was the #1 box office draw in the United States, not among child actors, not among actresses, in the entire industry. She outgrossed Clark Gable. She outgrossed Cary Grant. In 1935, the USA Treasury Department estimated her personal value to the American economy through merchandise, films, and tourism at over $45 million. Fox paid her mother $150 a week, not Shirley, her mother. This is a story about 3 children, 3 of the most famous names in the history of Hollywood, names you grew up with, names your parents knew. Shirley Temple, Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, and what the industry that made them famous did to them before any of them were old enough to understand what was being done. Not rumor, not allegation, documented, witnessed, in some cases, the subject of federal legislation, because what Hollywood did to its child stars was eventually so egregious, so undeniable, so thoroughly on the record that the state of California had to pass a law to stop it. The studios called it stardom. The law called it exploitation. The children called it their life, because they didn't know any different. Before we talk about these 3 children specifically, you need to understand the environment they were placed in. Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s did not have child labor laws that applied to the film industry, not in any meaningful sense. The studios had lobbied successfully, repeatedly, to exempt film production from the regulations that governed other industries. A 12-year-old could not legally work in a factory for 16 hours a day, but on a studio lot, with a signed contract and a parent's permission, it was entirely legal. The studios operated on a simple calculation. A child performer had a shelf life. The window between adorable and too old was narrow, sometimes as short as 2 or 3 years. The studios understood this. Their response was not to treat the child gently during that window. Their response was to extract everything possible before the window closed. 6-day weeks, 12, 14, 16-hour shooting days. No mandatory schooling hours. Tutors were brought to the set and worked around the production schedule. Not the other way around. No limit on consecutive shooting days. No guaranteed breaks. And always, underneath it all, the parents. This is the detail that gets complicated and uncomfortable and important. In almost every case of documented child exploitation in Golden Age Hollywood, a parent was present. A parent had signed the contract. A parent was receiving the salary. And a parent, for reasons that ranged from genuine poverty and desperation to outright greed, made the calculation that their child's well-being was a secondary consideration. The studios knew this. They counted on it. They structured contracts specifically to ensure that the parent's financial interest was tied to the child's continued performance. You don't rock the boat when the boat is paying your mortgage. 3 families, 3 children, 3 different versions of the same story. If you grew up in the 1930s or watched those films as a child yourself, you know that scene. Everybody knows that scene. The ringlets, the dimples, the voice that somehow managed to be simultaneously childlike and technically perfect. What you probably didn't know, what Fox worked very hard to make sure nobody knew, was what was happening when the cameras weren't rolling. Shirley Temple was discovered, in the loosest sense of that word, by a dance teacher named Charles Lamont in 1931. She was 3 years old. Her mother, Gertrude Temple, had been taking her to dance classes since she could walk. Gertrude had wanted to be a performer herself and had transferred that ambition, with considerable force, onto her daughter. By the time Fox signed Shirley in 1933, the studio had a precise formula for managing child performers. Keep the parent financially dependent. Keep the child working. Keep the public image relentlessly cheerful. And above all, keep the reality of the child's working conditions completely invisible. The reality was this. Shirley Temple's standard shooting day began at 5 a.m. Hair and makeup, the curls alone took 2 hours. 56 ringlets set every morning with a curling iron, then rehearsal, then filming, then looping, re-recording dialogue, then stills for publicity, then fan mail. She was required to sign photographs. She was 6 years old. Fox's publicity department constructed an elaborate fiction around her childhood. Fan magazines ran stories about her happy home life, her normal friends, her love of dolls. Almost none of it was true. Shirley Temple later wrote in her 1988 memoir, Child Star, one of the most quietly devastating memoirs ever published by a Hollywood figure, that she had almost no normal childhood friendships. Her social world was the studio. Her relationships were with adult coworkers. Her play was rehearsal. She wrote, "I stopped believing in Santa Claus when I was 6. Mother took me to see him in a department store, and he asked for my autograph. 6 years old, and already so famous that Santa Claus wanted her signature. The money is where the story becomes something beyond exploitation into something that looks, from this distance, like institutional theft." By 1938, Shirley Temple was earning $300,000 per film, an extraordinary sum in Depression-era America, the USS. Treasury Department's $45 million estimate of her economic value was considered conservative by industry analysts. Her parents received her salary, her mother managed it. The studio took its percentage. By the time Shirley Temple was an adult and had legal control of her own finances, the money was largely gone. Years of mismanagement, her mother's spending, and a trust structure that had been set up, ostensibly to protect her, in ways that primarily protected other people's access to her earnings. In Child Star, she wrote about discovering the financial reality of her childhood with a matter-of-factness that is more devastating than anger would be. All that money, all those years, and at the end, what was left wasn't much. What was left wasn't much. The studio knew. Fox's own financial records, examined by Shirley's father in the 1940s, showed systematic discrepancies in how her earnings had been accounted for. Nothing was ever pursued legally. The Temple family did not have the resources or the industry access to challenge 20th century Fox in court. There is one more thing about Shirley Temple's time at Fox that her memoir addresses with careful, controlled language. The kind of language that tells you the writer chose every word deliberately. She describes, in Child Star, an incident in 1937. She was 9 years old. She was called into the office of a senior producer at Fox, a man whose name she gives, Arthur Ungar, though some accounts have disputed the identification. He exposed himself to her. She was 9. She writes that she laughed, out of shock, out of confusion, out of the performer's instinct to manage an uncomfortable situation that had been drilled into her since she was 3. She left the office. She told no one. Because who was she going to tell? Her mother, whose salary came from the studio itself. She was 9 years old. She was the most famous child in the world, and she had no one to tell. Shirley Temple's Fox contract was not renewed when she turned 12. The studio sent a letter. No phone call, no conversation, a letter. The most valuable child performer in the history of the American film industry was let go by mail. She was 12 years old. She rebuilt her life, eventually married well, entered politics, became U.S. ambassador to Ghana and later to Czechoslovakia. By any external measure, a remarkable life. But she had been put to work at 3. She had been a global economic engine by 6. She'd been discarded by 12. And the money that engine had generated for Fox, for her mother, for the merchandise empire that bore her face, was largely gone before she was old enough to ask where it went. That is not a fairy tale. That is a business model. If Shirley Temple was Hollywood's golden child, Mickey Rooney was its engine. Between 1939 and 1941, 3 consecutive years, Mickey Rooney was the #1 box office star in America. Not the #1 child star, the #1 star. Full stop. He outgrossed every adult in the industry. He was 19 years old. And MGM was paying him less per week than it paid his on-set tutors. Joseph Ewell Jr. Mickey Rooney had been performing since he was 17 months old. His father was a vaudeville performer. His mother carried him on stage as a prop before he could walk. By the time he was 7, he had his own vaudeville act. By the time he was 12, he was under contract to MGM. MGM in the 1930s operated on a strict hierarchy of value. Adult male stars at the top, adult female stars below them, and child performers, regardless of box office performance, at the bottom of the salary structure. Because the studio had discovered that children could not negotiate. Their parents could, theoretically, but parents who were financially dependent on the studio's salary rarely pushed hard. Mickey Rooney's mother, Nell Carter, negotiated his MGM contract. She was not a sophisticated negotiator. She was a former vaudeville performer who had been managing her son's career since he was a toddler and who understood, instinctively, that the studio's offer was take it or leave it. She took it. The terms, $50 a week when he signed in 1934. Incremental raises built into the contract over 7 years. By 1939, when Mickey Rooney was the biggest star in Hollywood, he was earning $500 a week under his original contract structure. That same year, MGM's gross revenue from Mickey Rooney films was over $15 million. $500 a week, $15 million for the studio. The math does not require explanation. The working conditions were what you would expect from a studio that was simultaneously generating $15 million from a performer and paying him $500 a week. Mickey Rooney later described his MGM years with a directness that took decades to arrive at. In his 1991 autobiography, Life is Too Short, he wrote, "At MGM, I was property, not a person. Property. The difference is that property doesn't get to complain. Property doesn't get to complain. The shooting schedules were brutal. The Andy Hardy series, the franchise that made Rooney the biggest star in the world, produced a new film roughly every 4 months. Each one required months of pre-production, filming, and promotion. There was no off-season, there was no summer vacation, there was no such thing as a day off that wasn't scheduled into the production calendar. And then there were the pills. Mickey Rooney was among the first to publicly confirm in specific detail what MGM studio doctors were administering to their performers. He described it in interviews and in his memoir with clinical precision. Amphetamines to get through the shooting day, barbiturates to sleep, amphetamines to wake. Repeat, he said. They had us working days and nights on end. They'd give us pep pills to keep us on our feet long after we should have dropped from exhaustion. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us cold with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again. This went on week after week. Week after week. He was a teenager. When Mickey Rooney turned 21 and gained legal control of his finances, he discovered what Shirley Temple had discovered and what Judy Garland would discover. The money was gone. His mother had spent it. The trust structures that were supposed to protect his earnings had been set up in ways that made them accessible to everyone except him. He spent much of his adult life in financial difficulty, filing for bankruptcy at least once, working constantly, never quite catching up to the debt that had accumulated in his name while he was a minor. He married 8 times. He spoke in later years about the emotional consequences of a childhood in which his entire identity had been constructed by a studio. His relationships had been managed for publicity value, and his own feelings about any of it had been systematically irrelevant. He said, In a 2013 testimony before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging, still working at 92, still trying to reform the laws that had failed him, he said, "I was told what to do, where to go, what to say, and who to be. All my life, I was told who to be. All my life, I was told who to be." He was 92 years old, testifying before the U.S. Senate. And he was still describing what MGM had built into him when he was 12. Mickey Rooney died in 2014. He was 93 years old. He had been working, actively working, until weeks before his death. Not because he loved it, because he needed the money. The studio that had generated $15 million from his face in a single year paid him $500 a week. The money was gone before he was old enough to count it. He spent 70 years trying to earn it back. There is no voice in the history of American popular music quite like Judy Garland's. Not technically, though technically it was extraordinary. Something else. A quality that music critics have spent 80 years trying to name and haven't quite managed. The closest anyone has come is the conductor Arturo Toscanini, who heard her perform in 1940 and said simply, "That is the greatest natural vocal talent I have ever heard in my life. The greatest natural vocal talent, MGM heard it at 13 and put it on a schedule." Frances Ethel Gum, Judy Garland, had been performing since she was 2.5 years old. Her mother, Ethel, had been managing her career with a focused intensity that people who knew the family described consistently as something beyond ambition. According to biographer Gerald Clark, whose Get Happy drew directly on Garland's own partial memoir, Ethel had been giving Judy stimulants to get through long performances since before she was 10. The dependency that eventually killed her was already being built in childhood, before MGM ever saw her, but MGM industrialized it. When Wizard of Oz went into production in 1938, Judy was 16. The studio placed her on a diet of black coffee, cigarettes, and chicken soup. The MGM commissary had standing instructions. If Garland ordered a real meal, serve her coffee and soup instead. When she tried to eat something, the food was removed, and the studio doctors gave her Benzedrine, amphetamines to suppress her appetite, to hold her upright through 16-hour days, to keep her performing on demand regardless of what her body was telling her. When the Benzedrine made sleep impossible, barbiturates. When the barbiturates made the 5 a.m. call time impossible, Benzedrine again. She was 16 years old. Louis B. Mayer called her my little hunchback. She was 4'11" with a naturally petite build, and Mayer had decided she read as overweight on screen. He called her a fat little pig in pigtails, in front of other people, in front of her. She was 14 the first time he said it. What MGM built in Judy Garland's body between 1938 and 1950 wasn't addiction in the casual sense of the word. It was a complete pharmaceutical reconstruction of her nervous system. By the time she was 17, by the time Wizard of Oz had wrapped and she was doing 5 live shows a day on the promotional tour, her body had no reference point for what functioning without those drugs felt like. She would spend the next 30 years trying to find out, in her own words. From a 1967 interview, it was a 6-day work week at MGM for 14 years, with 18 and 24-hour shooting sessions and a very public life devoid of normal friendships. No normal friendships, because the studio sent monitors and chaperones whose job was to report back. Because every relationship Judy Garland had was conducted under observation. Because she was not a person with a private life. She was property with a public image. She had her first suicide attempt at 26. MGM's response was to hospitalize their asset long enough to stabilize it, then call it back to work. In 1950, after years of missed calls and delayed productions, the studio fired her. The official statement cited her unreliability. What the statement did not cite The unreliability was a direct consequence of the pharmaceutical regimen the studio's own doctors had been running since she was a teenager. MGM created the condition, filed her for having it. 28 years old, 31 films made, she rebuilt herself. The Carnegie Hall concert in 1961, still considered by music critics the single greatest live performance ever recorded, was not a final farewell. It was a working artist at the absolute peak of her technical powers. She gave everything that night, everything. But the foundation had been compromised since 1938. A 16-year-old girl had been handed her first amphetamine by a studio doctor paid by MGM, and nothing that came after, not Carnegie Hall, not 5 marriages, not the sheer extraordinary force of her talent, could fully undo what that first prescription had started. Judy Garland died in London on June 22, 1969, 47 years old. The coroner, Gavin Thurston, wrote, "This is a clear picture of someone who had been habituated to barbiturates in the form of Seconal for a very long period of time, habituated since childhood. The same class of drug, the same family of chemicals that a studio doctor had first placed in her hands when she was a teenager, 31 years later. In 1938, the same year MGM put a 16-year-old Judy Garland on her first amphetamine prescription, the state of California began drafting what would become the Coogan Law. The law was named after Jackie T. Coogan. He'd been Hollywood's first great child star, the boy who appeared opposite Charlie Chaplin in The Kid in 1921. He had earned, by conservative estimates, $4 million by the time he was in his mid-teens. When he turned 21 and asked his mother and stepfather to account for those earnings, he discovered there was almost nothing left. Legally, at the time, there was nothing he could do. Parents had complete legal control of their minor children's earnings. The money was theirs to spend. Coogan sued anyway. He recovered around $126,000 from an estate that had once held millions. The rest was gone, spent on furs, jewelry, cars, and a lifestyle his mother and stepfather had built on the earnings of a child. The Coogan Law, enacted in 1939, required that a portion of a child performer's earnings be set aside in a trust that the child could access upon reaching adulthood. It was the first legislation of its kind in the United States. It came too late for Jackie Coogan. It came too late for Shirley Temple, whose financial losses predated the law. It came too late for Mickey Rooney, whose contract had been signed before the law existed and whose earnings had largely been spent before it took effect. It came too late for all 3 of them. The law passed in 1939. Judy Garland's first prescription was 1938. 1 year. 1 year too late to protect the girl who would spend the next 31 years trying to get free of what a studio doctor put in her body in the year before the law existed. 3 children. 3 of the most famous names the 20th century produced, and 3 versions of the same institutional decision, that a child's talent was a resource to be extracted. Their earnings were available to whoever held their contract, and their long-term well-being was a cost that could be deferred indefinitely. Shirley Temple was put to work at 3. Her earnings were managed by her mother and a studio that structured her contracts to ensure they saw as much of it as possible. By the time she was an adult, most of it was gone. The producer who exposed himself to her when she was 9 faced no consequences. Fox sent her a letter when she turned 12. Mickey Rooney was the #1 box office star in America for 3 consecutive years. MGM paid him $500 a week. His mother spent the rest. He testified before the U.S. Senate at 92 about what had been done to him. He was still working at 93 because he needed the money. Judy Garland was handed her first amphetamine prescription at 16 by a doctor whose salary came from MGM. She spent the next 31 years trying to survive what that prescription started. The coroner, who examined her body in 1969, found evidence of dependency that had begun in childhood. The people who made these decisions, the studio executives, the doctors, the parents who signed the contracts and spent the money, most of them lived long lives and died with their reputations intact. The Coogan Law protected the children who came after. It did not reach back. You grew up watching these three: Shirley Temple's dimples, Mickey Rooney's energy, Judy Garland's voice. That voice. The one Toscanini called the greatest natural talent he had ever heard. You loved them. Generations loved them. And what you were never told, though, what the studios spent considerable effort ensuring you never found out, was what it cost those children to give you that. Shirley Temple was not a happy child performing for the joy of it. Mickey Rooney was not a natural entertainer who couldn't help himself. Judy Garland was not a troubled woman who destroyed herself. They were children, working in an industry with no rules to protect them, managed by adults whose financial interests were tied to their continued performance, and processed efficiently, profitably, completely by a system that understood exactly what it was doing and did it anyway. That system produced some of the greatest entertainment the 20th century ever saw. It also produced 3 children who never fully recovered from their childhoods. You deserve to know that. They deserve better than what they got.